But as a 22-year-old female, it's still fresh in my mind. My family lives in a small suburban town in North Texas. It was a weekend, and my mother had taken me and my younger brother, who was about 3 at the time, to the local mall for some school clothes. And I guess she was feeling particularly generous that day because, after clothes shopping, she promised to take us to the Disney store to pick out a toy. So we were in the Disney store and I was looking at this Little Mermaid Barbie doll. It was one of those you could take into the bath, and his hair changed colors. I was about to point it out to Mom when my brother started having a temper tantrum about something. Not sure what he was fussing about, but I remember her telling me to just wait a moment and turned her back to me while my brother started thrashing and trying to run off in the other direction. Since she was clearly occupied, I decided to just sit there and keep staring at the doll. That's when I noticed this man walk up beside me. He had noticed the doll I was staring at and started asking a few questions. What I liked so much about it, how many other dolls I had, if I thought his little girl would like it. I was kinda only half paying attention. I was way too absorbed in staring at the toy to even bother looking at the guy. I remember him asking how old I was, and the next thing I heard was my mother screaming my name as the guy picked me up and tried to fling me over his shoulder. I panicked. I screamed. As the guy was running, I guess I had managed to kick and flail enough for him to lose his grip on me. So there I was on the mall floor, crying and confused as my mom scooped me up, little brother in tow, and screaming for security. Apparently the guy had just kept running and he managed to get outside before they could call a lockdown on the building. We never heard any news back from the police on finding the guy. I also never got my doll. It was creepy and traumatizing, and I really wish it had ended there, but it didn't. About 2 months later, we had a new family move in right across the street. I remember my mom commenting on how weird it was because the house had only been on the market for a week. It was a couple slightly older than my parents with 2 little girls, one of which, Ashley, happened to be the same age as me. We became fast friends and I was so excited when she ended up being put in the same class as me. My dad, Darren, Ashley's dad, had also become fast friends as most of the people in the neighborhood were elderly, and he was just happy to have someone to talk to. We had a bunch of barbecues together, but Mom always insisted that family was weird. I thought it was rude how Ashley's mom never joined us. Anyways, since Mr. Darren, he insisted I call him by his first name, worked from home and Mom was always busy with my 3-year-old brother. It quickly became the norm that Darren would be the one to pick me up from school with Ashley. He'd always joked that I was almost more his daughter than my parents, which was a comment I shrugged off. And every day he'd ask me if I wanted to stay the night. I'd never spent the night at someone else's before, but it sounded like fun, and eventually I'd convinced my mom to let me. The first weird thing I noticed was that at dinner time, Ashley's mom was always really quiet and kept to herself. But I thought it was super weird that she had cooked dinner, set the table, then promptly went to her bedroom. When I asked Ashley why her mom wasn't joining us, I was promptly shushed and asked not to talk about her mom. So we ate, watched a few movies, then got ready for bed. This was weird thing number 2. When Ashley said it was bedtime, I said okay, and headed towards her bedroom. When I started crawling into her bed, she laughed and asked what I was doing. "We don't sleep in here, silly. We sleep with Daddy." She then took my arm and pulled me into her father's room, which I noted was not the same room her mother slept in. So her big sister, Ashley, and myself crawled up in bed with Mr. Darren. I thought it was really weird, but I'd never slept at anyone else's house before and just assumed different families did stuff differently. And before you ask, no, he didn't do anything to me. Or if he did, my mind has effectively blocked the memory. To my knowledge, it was just a normal night. Anyways, so the next day was Saturday. I went home and the weekend carried on like normal. Monday was when shit hit the fan, so to speak. It was lunchtime and our class had just piled into the lunchroom when I saw Mr. Darren sitting at our table and waving at us. Parents did visit during lunch on occasion, so that wasn't particularly weird. Him insisting on sitting next to me instead of his own daughter and having his arm around me the entire time was weird though. I started feeling uncomfortable but didn't say anything, mainly because Ashley had been glaring daggers of jealousy at me the entire time, and I was scared saying something would make it worse. Lunchtime ended, and it was time for recess. I said bye and told Mr. Darren I'd see him after school, and we headed outside. The moment we got to the playground, Ashley confronted me. "Daddy likes you. Now we have to move again." I had no clue what she meant by that, but she stormed off before I could ask. Then I saw Mr. Darren by the trees just outside the playground. That was weird. Parents weren't allowed to join during recess, and all these red flags started going up. I didn't know what was wrong, just that it was bad and I shouldn't go over there. He was calling me though, and had something in his hands. I really didn't want to be rude, so I walked over anyways. He said he had a present for me and gave me this pretty shiny pink wrapped box. I opened it up and guess what was inside? A color-changing little mermaid doll. I was super excited, but something in the back of my mind was saying it was bad. There was something important about this doll, I just didn't know what. Then he leaned down and whispered to me, "I remember how much you wanted this one." Now I was confused because I knew I'd never mentioned the doll to Mr. Darren before. I'd honestly forgotten about it. That's when things clicked. I dropped the doll, started to take a few steps back. I guess he noticed because he started trying to reassure me, I guess. He told me not to worry because he was gonna buy me all the Barbies I wanted. That he was gonna take me home tonight and I could be his little girl. And that he promised I'd be so much happier with him as my daddy. That's when I turned and ran. I bolted straight into the teacher's bench, crying my eyes out. I was too scared to even talk, so they took me to the counselor's office. Even after the counselor calmed me down, I never told them the whole story. I told them he'd scared me and told me he was going to take me away that night and that he was going to be my new daddy. That was enough for the school to call the police and file a restraining order, not letting him on school grounds. I guess I was afraid if I told them any more that my best friend Ashley would hate me. My parents took me home early. My dad went over and told Darren he was never to come near me again. Ashley wouldn't speak to me the next day, and a week later they moved. I never heard from or saw that family again. Looking back now, I realize just how much danger I was in. I also have some heavy speculations that Ashley and Skylar, older sister, may not actually have been Darren's children. I don't really know. I never told my parents the whole story. I often wonder if anything would have changed if I did, but I still to this day have nightmares about him breaking into my room at night. So, yeah. To the serial kidnapping bastard who tried to steal me from my mother, stalked me afterwards, and even became our neighbor just to get close to me, let's not meet again. 2. This happened to me when I was 15-ish. I'm now 21, but I'll try to write with as much detail as possible. So I play the cello, and my lessons were once a week. I had private lessons, and in the music academy I attended, we have jury every year, which is 3 teachers in the academy check if we're learning well by judging our skills, songs, and whatnot. My classes were on Thursdays, but this jury thing was on a Saturday. I always took the bus to my lessons. It sucked, because the cello is not little, and having to bring that along on a city bus causes a lot of people to stare, and even start conversations which I dread. On this particular Saturday, I had dressed fancy for the jury event, and was on my way home. I accidentally got off 2 stops before my stop because I had fallen asleep, and got off because I was too embarrassed to tell the driver I had messed up. I started walking to my house, which was now about a 25-minute walk. I was walking across the street to a mechanic auto repair shop, when I noticed a few of the workers staring at me. I could see them from my peripheral vision, but was pretending not to notice. One of them started catcalling and whistling at me. The other one laughed and made him stop, and I was grateful for him. Until he started running across the street towards me, yelling out, "Let me help you carry your guitar." I yelled back, "No thanks." But he came anyways, and started pulling at my guitar handle, and pulled it back, and we had a little tug of war with it. I got pretty scared, but didn't want to make it obvious, so I just told him I could carry it myself, and besides, the case had wheels. He asked me where I was going, and I said home. He then proceeded to ask me where I lived, what my age was, and if I had a boyfriend. The man was probably in his early 30s, and I was 15. I told him I was actually just going to meet someone at the store. There was a grocery store nearby, and I had forgotten about that. I thanked him for wanting to help and started walking to the store. To my dread, he said he could walk with me to the store and wait till I found the person I was meeting, and then maybe we could eat at the restaurant by the store. I politely declined and kept walking, but he came along anyways. Keep in mind that no one was going to meet me at the store, so I was like, crap. We got to the store and I had no idea how to play it off. I was just standing there like an idiot as this guy stared at me with a creepy smile. After about 5 minutes, he started laughing and said, "No one is here for you, huh?" I felt very uneasy, and now that I'm 21, I feel stupid as to why I didn't just ask an employee for help or something. But I left the store, and this guy just followed. I told him I'd walk home, and again he grabbed my cello. This time, he wouldn't let go, and I hated the fact that his hand was grabbing mine at the handle, so I let go. Now, I couldn't just tell him to leave because he had my cello. I let him walk me. As we were walking, he kept asking me about my boyfriend, and I told him I didn't have one. He then asked me who I lived with, and I lied, telling him I lived with 5 brothers. Then he asked for my name, and I actually gave him my name. Then he asked me out on a date, telling me to meet him at the restaurant by the store the next day for breakfast. I said no. At first he was just laughing, but as our conversation continued, He seemed frustrated and annoyed at all of my no answers. I was getting closer to my neighborhood, but I didn't want him to know where I lived. So I lied and told him my house was just around the corner. It was the neighboring neighborhood. He held out my cello and I grabbed it quickly. When I grabbed it, he let go but quickly put his hand over mine, and I gasped as he squeezed. I looked up at his face, and he had the scariest grin on his face. I still see it today. We just stared at each other for what seemed like a whole 10 minutes, but was probably like 30 seconds. I was just shocked, and he then loosened his grip and nastily caressed my hand and just moved his hand away while caressing it. I was so scared I didn't know what to do. Then to my horror, he told me he'd wait for me to go inside my house. He walked me up to my house and watched me as I started walking to the front door. This house wasn't even mine, and I literally just wanted to cry. I was about to ding-dong when a thought just hit my mind. Run. To this day, I don't even know how I ran that fast. I started full-on sprinting with my cello and all. I looked back and I saw him staring at my direction and started saying, "Hey girl, come back. Hey girl." I kept running and running until I got to my house. I took a long way to make sure I had lost him. I got to my front door and started crying. I was so out of breath though, and my crying sounded more like gasping and choking. Then, as I had calmed down, I didn't want to go into my house crying. I was about to ring the doorbell when I heard a laugh and a car whistle behind me. I looked back, but I didn't see him. To this day, I don't know if I was just that scared that I imagined it, or that he had actually managed to follow me home, but creep mechanic? Let's not ever meet again. 3. I would consider the place I grew up in to be reasonably safe. However, just like nearly everywhere else, there was a bad part of town. I was by no means horribly poor, but I had 7 siblings, and as we grew into our teenage years, we were old enough to go out and do things. But sending us all to the mall or to see a movie just didn't quite fit the budget. As a result, my siblings and I would often just walk around our town. It was rather old, and everything in it seemed so fragile and beautiful, and it fascinated me so much when I was younger that I always begged my brothers and sisters to take walks with me. I was the youngest, so my mom said I had to have one of the big kids with me because it wasn't safe. Eventually they got sick of seeing the same things over and over, and one by one they stopped going with me. By the time I was 14, only 2 of my siblings remained at home. Only having to support 3 kids took a load off the budget, so my 2 siblings refused to walk with me more often in favor of doing things that cost money. I begged my parents to let me walk by myself, claiming that I was old enough, and that I wouldn't go too far, etc. They allowed me, so long as I stayed within a certain radius of our neighborhood. However, at 14, I was sure I was all grown up, and decided to go further than my parents allowed. Though I didn't get tired of the same route I always took when I went on walks, I thought it would be fun to change things up. Of course, since this is a let's not meet, that was a mistake. I wandered around for a while, admiring my little town. As this was the early 2000s, it was less common for kids to have phones. And I didn't. I was a little out of sorts, having not been to that side of town much. but I had passed through it on my way to friends' houses and such. I wanted to leave myself enough time to get home before dark, so I decided to stop by a Pizza Hut that I had been to once or twice to see if someone had the time. As I walked towards the restaurant, I got a sort of prickly feeling, and that's when I started to realize I was on the wrong side of the tracks. I wasn't too concerned though. Our town was pretty clean cut, and even the bad side of town wasn't that bad. I popped into the Pizza Hut, and the lady behind the counter happily told me the time. It was a quick exchange, and I was out in seconds. It was late enough that I knew I had better head home, but early enough that I could dawdle and still be home easily before dark. So I left the pizza shop, hearing the bell on the door jingle as it fell shut behind me, only to hear it jingle again as the door reopened. I was standing on the sidewalk, waiting for a break in the traffic, so I could cross when the person who had left behind me stepped up to my side. I thought nothing of it, figuring he just needed to cross as well. I glanced over at him, giving him a smile, just trying to be friendly. He, however, took this as an invite to strike up a conversation. "Hello," he said. I muttered a hi in response. Right as there was a break in traffic, I stepped into the street, and so did the man. Again, my naive self just figured we were walking the same way. "You look just like my daughter," he said. By now, I thought he was a bit weird, but not threatening. He looked about my parents' age and was dressed fairly nicely. Still, I didn't particularly want to talk to the man, so I just replied, "Oh?" He smiled and said something along the lines of, "You're very tall and pretty, just like her." I nodded in response and just stared ahead, as he was starting to give me the creeps. Then he said something that sent me over the edge. "You also have beautiful long hair, just like her." And with that, he reached out a large hand and sort of petted my hair. That's when I realized that this guy was bad news. I sped up a bit, but he quickened his pace to match mine. Once again, I didn't respond. He kept making comments about my hair, then about my face, then about my body. They got more and more creepy each time. I finally got to an area that looked more familiar and knew I was only about 15 minutes from home. However, the man was still right next to me, and his comments had gone from innocent ones about my similarities to his daughter to creepier ones like how my body had a nice shape. By now I was totally panicking, but I thought that if I ran, he would grab me. I was just down the road from my home, my plan being to scream and run to the door last minute, when he made the creepiest comment of all, which I can still hear word for word in his voice, as though it's drilled into my head. "I bet a sweet girl like you has a tasty little treat hiding in those panties of hers." With those sickening words, I screamed Bloody Mary and ran like hell up my front porch steps and straight to my parents' room. By the time I got out, what had happened, and my dad had driven around the block to make sure the creep had left. My brother had called the police, and they were on their way. I filed a report, but never found the guy. I had nightmares for weeks, and it wasn't till my 3rd year of high school that I was willing to walk further than a block away from my house, alone. So creepy Pizza Hut pedo, let's not meet.